Two U.S. Navy ships have sailed through the Taiwan Strait in a passage the White House described as being consistent with international law. The sailing comes just weeks after the visit of U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. China objected to the visit and held its largest ever military drills around the island, to which Taiwan responded with its own set of exercises. All this has brought into sharp relief the question of how Taiwan defends itself against any possible Chinese invasion. DW's Zachary Lee and Cherry Chan report.
Robin Shi loves military hardware. He's a tour guide by day, but for the past 2 decades, he spent his spare time taking pictures of military exercises. When Taiwan responded to Chinese drills earlier this month with missile tests of its own, Shi was right there, filming.
I got here more than 2 hours before the announced time of the tests. I was worried that many people would come. I wanted to get the best spot.
As a former Navy radar operator, Shi also listens to radio message and tracks movement by both the Taiwanese and Chinese armed forces around the island. He says Taiwan has not done enough to improve its military strength.
We have never wanted to attack anyone. We are only developing weapons for self-defense. We should do more of that.
So he is happy to see that here in Pingtung County, a weapons manufacturer is carrying out missile and rocket tests. Taiwan faces unprecedented provocation from China, and now it is much more eager to develop its own missiles. At this military base behind me, a Taiwanese weapon developer is conducting a series of live-fire missile tests this and next month. They are held here regularly, but with escalating threats from China, they carry more significance than ever. Military experts say Taiwan needs to establish its own defense strategy, but not one based merely on how many weapons it has.
We must get better at asymmetric warfare. If we try to compete on the number of weapons, we will be dragged into an arms race. That would be really bad for us.
He says Taiwan has tried to move away from buying weapons from just one country, the US, but that has proved almost impossible.
Many countries have cited a variety of reasons for refusing to sell arms to Taiwan. For example, we have always wanted to acquire submarines from Germany.
For Robin Shi, the message is clear. Taiwan needs to be more confident in developing its own defensive capabilities. Only then can it stand up to the threat from abroad.
And nowhere is that threat felt more acutely, perhaps, than Taiwan's Jinmen Island, which lies less than 5 kilometers from China's coastline. And DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, joins me now from Jinmen. Richard, from where you are, give us a sense of the scale of the threat that Taiwan's facing.
Yeah, well, Biresh, there really is a sense at the moment that the threat from China is as big as it's ever been. And there's a sense of a potential kind of moment of truth approaching down the line. But just to give you a little bit of scene setting, first of all, of where I am here. I'm on an island actually called Little Jinmen, which is off Jinmen, this cluster of islands controlled by Taiwan, very close to the Chinese mainland. And if you just look behind me across the bay here, through the haze, you can see the Chinese city of Xiamen across the water, less than 5 kilometers, just like you said. And it feels so close. And these islands, Jinmen, they're no stranger to the China threat. So at the very end of the Civil War, 1949, the PLA were landing on these shores, trying to take these islands at the very end of the Civil War. And you still see these spikes, these defensive spikes, which are against landings taking place here, which are dotted all around these islands everywhere. So these islands really exude this sort of history of the conflict between China and Taiwan. But just very recently, during the Chinese exercises that took place to complain about the visit of US Speaker Nancy Pelosi, one of these islands, just the next one along, was buzzed by a Chinese drone, and the Chinese released footage from that drone which showed Taiwanese soldiers on the ground throwing rocks at this drone to try to shoo it away. And this really brought home some of the problems that Taiwan faces at the moment. The sheer proximity of China, but also the fact that all they had to shoo away these drones were rocks. So the Taiwanese government has been rushing now to say that they're going to secure for next year all sorts of anti-drone technologies. But really a kind of a little palpable and rather embarrassing reminder there of the threat.
And obviously leads to the larger question of what is Taiwan's strategy to defend itself from a much bigger neighbor?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is really an ongoing debate that's been heightened this year, not just because of the Pelosi visit, but also because of the Ukraine war. That's been really something of a wake-up call, not just for Taiwanese politicians, but Taiwanese military, but also ordinary Taiwanese people thinking, gosh, if it can happen there, it can happen here. And this is added to the debate, and we heard referred to just in the report there, about asymmetric warfare. The fact that Taiwan will never be able to match up with the Chinese in terms of numbers or in terms of military budget. So that it needs to be smart about using its limited military budget to buy the kind of weapons that it might be able to use to fight a bit like the Ukrainians in an invasion scenario. But even that is controversial, with some people saying, well, you can't just go for the sort of weapons that allow you to fight back once someone's invaded. You also want to deter that invasion. So really what you need is a sort of balance between big ticket military items and the smaller scale ones. But this does bring us also to a certain amount of tension between Taiwan and the United States, with the sense that I've been getting from some people I've been talking to privately here in Taiwan, that they get the sense that the Americans still have been dragging their feet in providing some of the weapons that they really need. So all is not necessarily particularly well also in the relationship between the US and Taiwan in dealing with this threat from China.
You earlier spoke of a moment of truth approaching, Richard. Has that moment of truth arrived there because of Nancy Pelosi's recent visit?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, there are all sorts of different takes on Nancy Pelosi's visit and what the Chinese exercises that took place after it mean. Some people I've been talking to here say that they do feel that the Chinese did show a degree of restraint in those exercises, but what they also did was establish what's being talked about as a new normal. That Chinese fighter jets, for instance, now go further than they did across what's called the median line, the line sort of in between Taiwan and China in the Taiwan Strait. But the kind of moment of truth that I'm really talking about here is the fact that China says that it wants to reunify, as they put it, with Taiwan, and a growing majority of the people of Taiwan say that they simply don't want that. How do you resolve that then without going to war?
Richard Walker, lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us from Jinmen Island. And tensions over Taiwan are having an impact on other countries in the region as well. Japan, for instance. Its westernmost island, Yonaguni, lies just 108 kilometers east of Taiwan. It is in fact closer to Taipei than it is to Tokyo. And that has its 1,500 residents worried it could become a new front line if hostilities break out in the future.
Fisherman Ishinari Toshitsugu makes everything shipshape for his next big catch. He needs one urgently because he hasn't been able to fish as usual. After the recent Chinese military drills around Taiwan, the 32-year-old was banned from heading out to sea for 5 days. It was deemed too dangerous because of the proximity to the contested island nearby.
The rockets fell into the sea just 80 kilometers from here. We could hear it happen. And how did the government in Tokyo react? With a silly piece of paper. They sent us a fax to inform us about it. What am I to make of that?
The island of Yonaguni is some 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo, but it feels like half a world away. Fishing and pony breeding are the economic lifeblood of the island, which rarely receives visitors. Our cameras are a cause of interest straight away.
You're here because of Taiwan, right? I couldn't think of another reason.
Normally, I don't think about this. But I recently started worrying about the future. The future of the island, or rather the protection of it, has traditionally been entrusted to the so-called shisa, mythical guardians made of stone that keep evil spirits away. But the mayor isn't happy to rely on them for protection against China. He wants to be able to evacuate the island in the event of an attack, which is a challenge considering the small harbor and short runway.
It's all about saving lives. It's crucial to avoid a scenario like in Ukraine, where civilians and soldiers are bundled up together.
The island is home to a radar station, and 160 defense troops have taken up residence to monitor the airspace and the sea. But nobody on the island really believes that they can prevent a potential attack by China. Masahisa Sato sits in the Japanese parliament in Tokyo. He understands the concerns of Yonaguni's residents, but says it's important to look at the big picture. The whole area is a battlefield, he says, not just Taiwan, all of this area.
It's not just about Yonaguni, but also about the hundreds of thousands of residents of the other islands in the vicinity, about the evacuation of the Taiwanese, Japanese, Americans, and Europeans who live there. We also have the difficult task of improving our defense capabilities in the region.
In the meantime, the fishermen of Yonaguni are still waiting for their next big catch, hoping that peace prevails on the island and beyond.